For almost 3,000 years, the Trojan War was the most famous event that never happened. A 10-year siege over a stolen queen, fought by men who were half the sons of gods, ended by a giant wooden horse. It was poetry, everyone agreed, glorious and invented, no more real than the gods who meddle in it. And then, in the 1870s, a German businessman with a copy of Homer and almost no training started digging into a hill in northwest Turkey, exactly where the poem said a city should be. And he found one. He found 9 of them, stacked on top of each other, and one of them had burned. Start with the story, because most of what people think they know is the movie, not the poem. The war we picture comes mainly from Homer's Iliad, composed around 700 BCE, and here is the first surprise. The Iliad does not actually contain most of the Trojan War. It covers a few weeks in the 10th and final year. There is no abduction of Helen in its pages, no wooden horse, no fall of the city. It opens on a bitter quarrel over honor between 2 Greek warlords, Agamemnon and Achilles, and it closes on the funeral of the Trojan prince Hector. The famous furniture, Paris and the Golden Apple, the 1,000 ships, the horse, the sack, comes from other poems, later summaries, and Roman retellings, above all Virgil's Aeneid, written 700 years after Homer. The Trojan War as one clean narrative is a thing assembled over a millennium. Homer is just the oldest and greatest piece of it. And in that story, the war is already ancient to Homer himself. Set in an age of bronze, of great kings in stone citadels, of warriors who fight from chariots and are buried with gold. The Greeks called them the heroes, and believed they had really lived, centuries before, in a grander age that had passed. The traditional date, calculated by later Greek scholars, put the fall of Troy around 1200 BCE, give or take. That is 400 to 500 years before Homer ever sang. Hold onto that gap, it is the whole problem. For most of history, nobody could test any of it, because nobody knew where Troy was, or whether it had ever been anywhere at all. Enter Heinrich Schliemann, wealthy, relentless, and shamelessly self-mythologizing. Guided by the geography in the poems, and by an Englishman named Frank Calvert who had already identified a promising mound and owned part of it, Schliemann began tearing into the hill of Hisarlik, near the mouth of the Dardanelles, in 1871. His method was brutal. He drove an enormous trench straight down through the center of the mound, and in his hurry to reach Homer's city he blasted through and destroyed much of what he was looking for. But he proved the one essential, shocking thing. Under that hill lay not a city but a layer cake of them. At least 9 major cities built and rebuilt on the same spot across more than 3,000 years, labeled Troy 1 at the bottom to Troy 9 at the top. There was a real place here, lived in for millennia, commanding the strait between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Troy was not nowhere. Troy was aware. Then Schliemann overreached, as he always did. In 1873, he uncovered a hoard of golden jewelry, diadems, cups, beads, declared it Priam's treasure, the wealth of Troy's last king, and famously had his wife photographed wearing what he called the jewels of Helen. It was a sensation. It was also wrong by about 1,000 years. The treasure came from Troy II, a city that burned around 2400 BCE, more than a millennium before any war Homer could have meant. Schliemann had dug straight past the right city to reach a richer-looking wrong one. Which raises the question his successors spent the next century chasing. If any of these 9 cities is Homer's Troy, which one? The serious candidates sit in the late Bronze Age, the era the legend points to. Troy VI was grand, steep, finely cut sloping walls, watchtowers, a prosperous town, and it ended around 1300 BCE, possibly thrown down by an earthquake, since the ground there is seismically violent. Its successor, Troy VIIa, is the one that makes the hair stand up. It was a city under stress. The fine houses subdivided into cramped quarters, huge storage jars sunk into the floors as if hoarding against a siege. And it ended, around 1180 BCE, in fire. Excavators found arrowheads lying in the streets, scatters of sling stones, and human remains left where they fell, a body in a doorway, bones unburied in the open. Carl Blegen, who excavated in the 1930s, argued that Troy VIIa was the Homeric city, destroyed by human violence close to the traditional date. The debate between earthquake Troy and war Troy has never entirely closed. Then, in our own time, the picture got bigger, literally. From 1988, the German archaeologist Manfred Korfmann re-excavated Hisarlik and found that the famous citadel, the part Schliemann had gutted, was only the crown of something much larger. Reading the buried ground with magnetometers, Korfmann traced a sprawling lower town below the fortress, ringed by a defensive ditch cut into the bedrock. A city perhaps 10 times the size anyone had assumed, home to maybe 5,000 to 10,000 people, though some archaeologists still dispute that scale. This was no mere hilltop fort. This was a substantial Bronze Age city, perfectly placed to grow rich, taxing the ships that waited, sometimes for weeks, for the wind to turn before they could row up the Dardanelles. A place, in other words, very much worth fighting over. And here is where the evidence stops being stones and starts, astonishingly, to talk. Because Bronze Age Troy did not sit in isolation. To its east lay the Hittite Empire, a Bronze Age superpower whose royal archives, thousands of clay tablets, survived the fall of its capital and have been read. In those Hittite letters, written during the very centuries of Troy VI and VIIa, there is a city in the northwest, in precisely Troy's region, that the Hittites call Wilusa. Linguists connect Wilusa directly to the Greek name for Troy, Ilios, in its older form Wilios, the very word buried in the title Iliad. And the Hittite texts treat Wilusa as a recurring headache, contested, rebellious, fought over. They name a king of Wilusa called Alaksandu, who signs a treaty with the Hittite emperor. Alexandu, Alexandros, the other name in Homer of the very prince we call Paris. It gets stronger. The same archives speak again and again of a powerful kingdom across the sea to the west, called Ahhiyawa, whose people raid and meddle along the Anatolian coast and at times stir up rebellions, including around Wilusa. Most scholars now accept that Ahhiyawa is the Hittite spelling of the Achaeans, which is Homer's own word for the Greeks. So lay the documents side by side. A real city in the right place, with a name that becomes Troy. A real king there with a name that becomes Paris. And a real Greek sea power, named in the records, fighting and scheming over that very city in the right century. Not one tidy Trojan War, but a long, real history of Greeks and Anatolians coming to blows over Wilusa, written down at the time by a third party with no epic to sell. That is not the same as proving the Iliad, and this is exactly where the honest line has to be drawn because two opposite errors crowd in. One is the debunker's shrug. It is just a myth, ignore it. The Hittite records make that untenable. The other is the overclaim, the one the documentaries and the 2004 film lean on, that Schliemann proved Homer right, that we have found Helen's Troy and Achilles' War. We have not. There is no trace of Helen, no Achilles, no Agamemnon in any contemporary record. There is no evidence for a single 10-year siege, and the wooden horse appears in no archaeology anywhere. The horse may be pure literary invention, or, some have suggested, a poetic memory of something else. A siege engine, or even an earthquake, the work of Poseidon, who in Greek myth is both the earth shaker and the god of horses, leveling the famous walls. That last idea is a guess, clearly labeled, hanging on the earthquake damage to Troy VI. It is a maybe, not a finding. So what actually happened? The most defensible answer is also the most satisfying one. There was a real, rich, much-fought-over city, exactly where Homer placed it. It was repeatedly in conflict with a real Greek-speaking sea power, in the right era, on the record. And at least one version of that city, Troy VIIa, was destroyed by war around 1180 BCE. Homer, composing 4 or 5 centuries later at the far end of a long oral tradition that sang of the lost age of bronze, inherited not a newspaper report but a deep, compressed, half-true memory. Many raids and sieges telescoped into one great war, real kings fused with legend, a genuine Bronze Age world remembered in astonishing physical detail and harnessed to a story about rage and honor and the price of a single city. The Iliad is not history, but it is not nothing. It is a memory with a real city at the bottom of it. And that is the genuinely staggering thing, more than any treasure. A poem was sung and resung for centuries before anyone wrote it down, across a dark age in which Greece had forgotten how to write at all, and it still carried, intact enough to dig up, the location of a real Bronze Age citadel and the shape of a real Bronze Age war. We tend to think of memory as the opposite of evidence. Troy says that sometimes, if you sing it carefully enough, a memory is a kind of evidence, waiting 3,000 years for a stubborn man with a spade to take it literally, and, for once, be partly right. The wooden horse never stood on that plain, but the walls did. And someone, on a windswept hill above the Dardanelles, really did watch them burn.